Now, the cost of Irene likely to run into the billions, but it is going to be much less than expected because the storm itself got downgraded as it approached New York. Now, the number comes from Charles Watson. He's the director of research and development at consulting firm Kinetic Analysis. Chuck, thanks so much for joining us. I know you're joining us via Skype from Savannah, Georgia. Your estimate I'm looking at here is something more in the $3 billion range to insurers, right?
That's right, and this storm is really pretty interesting as you would compare it to historical hurricanes, because normally you would expect the insured losses to be about half of your storm total. But in this case, we're expecting only about 40% of the losses to be covered by insurance, partly because this is a flood event more so than a wind event. But the other interesting dynamic in the insurance industry is that deductibles have been going from a fixed deductible to a percentage-based deductible all across the coastal areas. So for an insurer, it helps them quite a bit. Just for example, say a $200,000 house that used to have maybe a $500 deductible, well, now the homeowner is going to be looking at a 2% deductible. So that's $4,000 out of pocket before the insurer starts to pay. So that's a very important dynamic. Storm.
Chuck, overall, I mean, we've had, this is not just the only catastrophe, right, that we have had, or natural disaster we've had here in the U.S. and also around the world. We had the earthquake in Japan earlier this year. We just had an earthquake last week. Is any of that going to fundamentally change the way these insurance companies price risk?
It's possible. Well, of course, the first thing they do is look to see what the losses actually were. Remember that these numbers we're kicking around now are all based on computer models. So as nice as we like to think the models are, that's what I do, is design these computer models. They are just models, so we got to wait for the real numbers to come in. But you mentioned the Japan. That's an interesting place. The Japanese insurance market is very different than the U.S. Insurers don't have nearly as much exposure as they do. The Virginia earthquake caused a lot of commotion, particularly in Washington and along the East Coast, but really not that much damage. Now, the earlier events, the tornadoes, the other floods we've had, those have taken a hit on insurers, but I'd say this isn't the straw that broke the camel's back. We really haven't tapped into the reinsurance or the insurance-linked securities markets so much for these events. If we do have a big event, the industry could be in trouble, but I think things are okay for now. Okay,
and your $3 billion estimate to insurers, I mean, you say that that's all based on models. So what could change that then, Chuck?
What you're showing on the screen right now, the floods. And of course, that won't hurt the insurers that much. Again, that's the important thing. There's really very little private flood insurance in the U.S. That's all covered by FEMA and the Federal Flood Insurance Program. So the big uncertainty in our numbers has to do with how much additional flooding there'll be and just what the damages of that are. We could see our total number go up another billion and a half. So instead of 7, you'd be looking at maybe 8 or 9. But we don't expect the private insurer market to take much of that hit, again, because the winds just weren't high enough, and wind is what the exposure is for the private markets.
I see. And then just quickly, Chuck, I mean, your original estimate, I think, was something like $14 billion. So you took that down primarily because the storm was not as big as originally predicted. Is that right?
Yeah, and I'm a little bit happy about that. We started backing off on our numbers by morning, certainly mid-morning Friday, because we saw the storm, you can see behind me on the screen, was starting to fall apart. It was in training dry air, the meteorology term. It was weakening. So all of our computer models really crashed the intensity and dropped it from 20 billion to under 10 billion, literally within a few hours. And, so we did have some confidence with those numbers to work with.
Chuck, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Chuck Watson, Director of Research and Development for Kinetic Analysis.